So just before we begin this, a brief word of, I guess, kind of disclaimer. A lot of the stuff in this is extrapolation. A lot of this is me trying to fill in the gaps and make sense of a storyline that J.K. Rowling's not a political writer, she's not a historical writer, so I don't think she really knows what she's doing a lot of the time. I tried to take the stuff that she gave us and try to draw it parallels to historical events and to real-world politics, especially regarding what I think she was kind of trying to base it on. So Cornelius Fudge, I think, is by far the most unfairly treated character in the entire Harry Potter franchise, and I think there's a lot of reasons for this. You have to keep in mind that Harry Potter and his friends are unreliable narrators. They have very limited knowledge of the Wizzarding world. Harry and Hermione were raised by Muggles. Not only Muggles, but Muggles who had, I think, a very modern set of values and very kind of modern worldview. So you have to keep that in mind. They don't know anything about Wizzarding history. In fact, they actively don't really pay attention during Wizzarding history. Harry is not an intellectual. He's not a thinker. He just believes whatever he's told. And Hermione is basically an SJW. Also, I'm pretty sure, and we'll go into detail about this, that Dumbledore leads the left in Wizarding Society, and sometimes the far left in Wizarding Society. So everything we see in the books is from the perspective of the left or far left of, and everything colors that. It's also from a group of people who have either a very colored view of the past, or are particularly interested in the past, or interested in how society actually functions. So I think that's important to keep in mind whenever we talk about any aspect of people who don't agree with the protagonists are treated as being cartoonishly evil, corrupt, or stupid. That all being said, let's look a bit at Fudge's past. More specifically, let's look at what the Wizarding world was under the circumstances where he came to power. Because I think it's extremely important to doing him justice as a politician to look in what he inherited. It's not really fair, I think, to judge politicians unless you look at the situation that they came into. Like, a lot of people criticize Abraham Lincoln, but he was inheriting an extremely bad situation decades of politicians had failed to properly deal with. So I think when we're judging someone like Lincoln's responses to things, we have to keep in mind the circumstances under which he came into power, which are not those that a normal leader would have faced. Like, a normal American president isn't facing mass secession and civil war. So the Wizarding world is substantially more conservative than mainstream Britain is. It seems to largely be in the Victorian era, or at least the pre-World War II era, maybe even the pre-World War I era. There seem to be much more proper views on sexuality, on things like gender roles, on hierarchy. There doesn't seem to be the kind of the post-war complete focus on the individual above everything else, to the complete detriment of society. So that being said, when any kind of modern ideas from the Muggle world entering, it's not just like Muggle ideas are entering from the 1950s, under which some liberalism has happened, but it's like taking ideas from the 1960s and dropping them in the middle of Victorian England. And from the brief amount of history we have regarding the time period prior to the Second Wizarding War, there was a squib rights movement that was said to be similar to the civil rights movement in America. My guess would be that was to try to change the electoral system to make it more democratic, to liberalize Wizarding society, to just kind of in general destroy a lot of the past culture and replace it with a contrived modern one, which is what happened in real life. I would also assume that this is when mass immigration started in Wizarding Britain. So you have essentially a Victorian society that's undergoing 1960s style revolutions in sexual morality, social structure, electoral system, probably economy, and it's just kind of being bombarded and now is being faced with mass immigration and forced multiculturalism and all those kind of aspects. So it's only natural that people would begin to react violently against that. I mean, in real life, people reacted against it, but this is an even more stark contrast between how conservative the base society was and how much kind of leftism was being imposed on it. I also get the impression that Dumbledore is the head of the Wizarding left and may even be kind of a demagogue. If you look at his followers, It's all the more liberal wizards like the Weasleys who are enamored with Muggle technology and modernity. Kind of modern, thoughtish girls like Nymphadora Tonks. All sorts of kind of other misfits, left-wing political figures, criminals, and Muggleborns. So I would imagine that there was a coalition around Dumbledore that was becoming more and more virulent and pushing for what they would consider their rights and pushing for the transformation of society in the 1960s. And in the face of this attempt to rapidly transform society, I think the purebloods, who hold a lot more power in the wizarding world, it's only natural that there was going to be a counter-reaction or a counter-revolution, and that seemed to coalesce around Voldemort. Now, as to the Death Eaters, a lot of them are probably pureblood aristocrats. But if you look at the movies, a lot of the Death Eaters seem to be working-class native Britons, probably who were upset due to affirmative action and their needs and interests being sidelined in favor of Muggles and other kind of outsiders being brought in. So I think it kind of, and this is what happened in Nazi Germany, is you kind of had a coalition that eventually formed between the authoritarian conservatives who wanted to go back to what it was like in the German Empire, and the more kind of radical right who coalesced around Hitler. Look at it, that's really what Voldemort's coalition is. You have demagogues and populists, but you also have a lot of aristocrats, and there is kind of an uneasy alliance between the two of them. So as with most political situations in which there's two kind of extreme factions, the society eventually destabilized and broke down. So from what little we can determine, in the 1960s, a left-wing radical came to power, Eugenia Jenkins, who put down the purebloods' attempts to stop social change and introduce dramatic and probably radical reforms to overhaul wizarding society. So amidst this political climate, Voldemort rose up and decided that political options exhausted, it would take a war to stop social change and to restore wizarding society to its former greatness. So then we had a civil war that lasted over a decade, in which Voldemort's partisans and Dumbledore's partisans engaged in raid and counter-raid, and numerous atrocities were committed. Now, we're told that there was no atrocities basically committed on the light side, but I really don't believe that. From what little I can determine, one radical minister was replaced with another who increased efforts in the war to fight against the Death Eaters' opposition to social reforms. So you had more or less a decade of warfare in which neither side was really able to gain a decisive edge. And Voldemort kind of died in the end, not because he was militarily defeated, but because he died as the result of a prophecy. So Voldemort not being militarily defeated, a number of his followers, mainly the more fanatical ones, and the more crazy ones, were kind of thrown under the bus and sent to Azkaban, but it seems like the majority of his followers succeeded in evading capture. So we have an ending of a war that really resolved nothing and resulted in a marginal light side victory, although most of the purebloods maintained their fortunes, and I would imagine that their counter purges had succeeded in doing immense damage and killing most of the reformers. So a heavily divided wizard society had to find a leader that would be acceptable both to the left and to the right. So into that void, I think they chose Fudge because he was a compromise candidate. He was a moderate conservative who was largely inoffensive, and while sympathetic to conservative interests, was not particularly violent, radical, or extreme in his political views. And from what little we can determine, it seems that he took moderately conservative positions and largely left wizarding society alone, trying hard to moderate between the remaining Death Eaters who still held him. Oh, he should have given all the Muggleborns rights. He should have brought in more mass immigration. He should have done this. He should have done that. But he was attempting to deal with a society in which no side had decisively lost a civil war. It wasn't like the Spanish Civil War where the Nationalists won a decisive victory and they were able to achieve peace by basically annihilating what was left of their political opposition. We had two very much intact political groups, and most of Fudge's decisions I view as an attempt to not restart the Civil War. which had killed such a large portion of the Wizzarding population. So you can criticize him for that, but I think ultimately he was able to buy 6 years of relative peace, and while he might not have been an inspired or decisive leader, I don't think that was really something he could have done. I think if he had have tried to take action one way or another, it would have ignited the Civil War sooner. I think if Voldemort had not come back, which is kind of unexpected, you don't really expect someone to come back from the dead as a complete psycho and restart a political movement, compromise might have lasted another decade. However, like the Weimar Republic, in which both the far right and far left were quite strong, eventually the division in society, particularly I would imagine after the death of Dumbledore, and someone more radical and less politically savvy like Hermione Granger taking the reins of power, the whole thing was destined to collapse and lead to another civil war. In the meantime, though, Fudge had no real way, as far as I can determine, in resolving the underlying issues, and all he could do was try to keep the peace so that Wizarding society would heal. So I'd like to go through his decision throughout the books and movies that he was maligned for, and try to give the alternative perspective. So one of the formative events of Cornelius Fudge's life was he was one of the first people on the scene after Sirius Black killed Peter Pettigrew. He saw the burned and charred bodies. I think Sirius Black apparently was accused of killing like 13 muggles, and he found this massive crater in the street and all these dead people everywhere. And he saw Sirius Black laughing maniacally and developed a lifelong hatred for the man. And this is portrayed in the books as being a monomania, or being Fudge just wanting a scapegoat. But I think in a very real sense he viewed Sirius Black as a particularly sociopathic and sadistic Death Eater. And I think given the fact that he was there pretty much when Sirius Black was framed, I think his hatred of the man was completely justified. It's kind of like being the first on the scene after the James Holmes murder, where he shot up the theater, seeing all the bodies everywhere. And I forget if James Holmes was laughing manically, but him just laughing manically and bragging about how great the mass murder was and how much he enjoyed it. So I think it's pretty justified that he despised Sirius Black. And you have to understand there's no real way he could have known that Sirius was innocent. There was really no evidence to that point other than the word of Dumbledore, who hadn't actually seen anything, Harry Potter, who frankly is a mentally unstable kid. And yeah, there was nothing he really could have done about it. So Fudge was appointed Minister of Magic in 1990, like I said, as a compromise candidate. Dumbledore was viewed as the likely replacement for him, but I think the Wizarding world decided that appointing a leftist like Dumbledore to such a high position of power. It's said that he, in his early days, constantly sent letters to Dumbledore asking for help. He also is shown to lean heavily on Lucius for help. This makes sense as a compromise candidate, in my opinion, that he would talk to the two leaders of both political factions and try to find common ground and try to take a path in which he would not overly devastate either of them. Now, the Quibbler says that Gringotts he attempted to nationalize Gringotts, and they made all these stories up that he had killed a number of goblins. I find that extremely unlikely. And keep in mind, the Quibbler is kind of like the equivalent of, I'm trying to think, what's a really trashy left-wing news site? Salon or Slate or some really left-wing thing. It seems like that whole thing was completely made up. All we have to go on is Luna, who's obviously schizophrenic and completely crazy. So, let's move into the next time Fudge is mentioned in the story, which is the Chamber of Secrets. So he arrived after there were 4 attacks on Muggle-born witches and wizards, and when he arrived, he removed Rubeus Hagrid and sent him to prison. He says not as a punishment, but as a precaution. Fudge assured Hagrid that he would be released immediately if another person was found to be responsible. Dumbledore tried to convince Fudge that taking Hagrid would make no difference. A lot of people criticize Fudge for just assuming that Hagrid was guilty, and they criticize everyone for thinking Hagrid was guilty the first time. I mean, if you were in that position, wouldn't you have thought Hagrid is guilty? You have the word of Harry Potter to go on that he was having visions or something, or hearing voices, and that like it might have been a snake, and it's all very vague, and I don't even know if there were basilisks left in the world or if they're basically extinct, so no one really knows. And you have this guy who's obsessed with monsters and wants dragons and all these like dangerous creatures that he keeps around, like Aragog or whatever, who eats people. And you have this guy, and you're like, well, I wonder who could be attacking things, or who could be attacking students. Maybe it's this guy who raises monsters and doesn't really watch them and just lets them go on the loose. So I don't really see why that was so like controversial and why he's such a bad guy for doing it. But whatever. So then we had whatchamacallit, we had Sirius Black escaping from from Azkaban. So Fudge got extremely upset about it, and people were like, well, Fudge was obsessed with Sirius Black, Fudge was persecuting him. Well, he had watched Sirius Black basically kill like 14 people in cold blood and laugh maniacally about how much he enjoyed it. So I think the fact that he saw Sirius Black, also Sirius Black, and to his knowledge, had betrayed the children of the Messiah of the Wizarding world. Imagine if, let's see here, someone had betrayed Jesus, Mary, and Joseph to, I don't know, the Jewish Sanhedrin, and they executed them. And then after that, he went on a mass murder spree and killed 13 people. Do you think society would have a very high opinion of that person? No. So a bunch of other stuff happened. He had the misguided attempt to have the Dementors at the school, which was a screw up, to be sure. I think that's one of the few things you can really criticize him for. I think he was just being overcautious and overly afraid. I think it's very important to keep that, what I keep mentioning about him and Sirius Black in mind, as kind of the justifiable roots of his paranoia regarding him. So let's see here. So Fudge arrived at Hogwarts again later that year to check on the Black situation, to witness the execution of Buckbeak the Hippogriff. So as we know, Draco Malfoy was kind of rude to Buckbeak and basically kind of goaded him into attacking him, and I think slashed him up pretty bad. But because Draco's a dick, we're supposed to accept that it's okay to have dangerous animals that, if you offend, will try to kill you with their claws. I'm sorry, I believe that human life is inherently more valuable than animals. I think it is justifiable to put Buckbeak down. I mean, I know they were being stupid, but it's this dangerous animal that's proven that they attack humans if provoked. So yeah, I think it was justifiable in that circumstance, and he's treated as a monster because of it. But Buckbeak is an animal and Draco is a person. Whether or not Draco is an asshole or not is kind of irrelevant. Oh, let's see here. So they attempt to convince Fudge that Peter Pettigrew is still alive, and they don't really believe, he doesn't really believe them, because why would he believe them? The whole story is really fanciful and is kind of weird, and if I was Fudge, I wouldn't really believe these kids who don't really know anything about the situation, who just kind of come up with this really outlandish theory that Pettigrew faked his own death and framed Sirius Black for it, and that Peter Pettigrew had been a rat who had been hiding out with the Weasleys for the last like 15 years. It doesn't make a ton of sense to me. Then we had the Quidditch World Cup. Nothing that much really happened there. So then we have the whole Barty Crouch incident, which I didn't think really made much sense. But Fudge apparently really hated half giants. How could he hate giants? I mean, the way giants are portrayed in the story is they're basically all mass murder. They're all just crazy, and they kill and eat each other. And they were almost extinct because they're so violent and they're so prone to killing one another. Why would Fudge have any sort of prejudice against them? Sorry that the sarcasm's super the sarcasm's too obvious, but I mean, Voldemort was able to get them to like massacre civilian populations and presumably like eat them, and there's constant wars within the community. So the fact that he's kind of weary around giants is kind of natural. I mean, is it a form of irrational discrimination if you're kind of scared about being around a tiger or some other dangerous animal that's known to eat people? Well, I guess it is. So after the Triwizard Tournament, when Harry exited with Cedric Diggory's dead body, Fudge didn't believe him that Voldemort had come back. And to be honest, why would he believe him? Harry is an emotionally traumatized kid who's known to hear voices, have visions about Voldemort, has severe PTSD. So Harry's completely unreliable. Also, he's really young. So we have that aspect to it. So I think Fudge's explanation was Barty Crouch was behind the whole thing, and the trauma of confronting him and having Sirius died, combined with Harry's latent instability, made him have a hallucination about Voldemort. I mean, and people are like, well, he should have believed him that Voldemort conducted an elaborate ritual and came back from what everyone assumed was his death. I mean, is that really that plausible even in the Wizarding world? We don't really have people like directly come back from death that often. Most people didn't even know what a Horcrux was, let alone that Voldemort had made any. So Harry only referenced people who were accused as being Death Eaters, and Fudge was like, well, you probably have read about the Death Eaters in the war because your parents died in it, and you probably read all of these names. So he didn't believe the whole So he didn't believe them. He thought Harry was either making it up or was delusional. He was kind of disturbed that Dumbledore just believed this obviously emotionally unstable kid and was maintaining a fiction that would probably lead to being ousted and a breakdown of the peace that he had fought so hard to have. So then Dumbledore reactivated the Order of the Phoenix, which is a paramilitary organization, basically a vigilante group of heavily armed wizards who run around doing stuff without the approval of the government. So yeah, I mean, they're like, well, he didn't really like that Dumbledore had his own private army that he sent around to do missions for him. Well, what government would like someone having their private army, especially someone who's a known political leader, especially someone who could use their army to destabilize society and lead to another civil war? So a bunch of other stuff happened, so he tried to discredit and get rid of Harry, because once again, I think what Fudge was guilty of was trying to maintain the peace at all costs. He didn't really like Squibs for whatever reason, but whatever. Everyone has their own kind of stuff. So he sent Dolores Umbridge, and Umbridge is absolutely a wretched woman. I think the Ministry needed to try to get some control over Hogwarts. I mean, pretty much every year you had a crazy man who was trying to get the secret to immortality. You had like a giant 3-headed dog that was in the school. You had a basilisk that was roaming around turning people to stone. You had a dangerous mass murderer who succeeded in getting into the school. And you had a Death Eater who was operating, who had taken the identity of a teacher for the whole year. There was absolutely no confidence, correctly so, that Dumbledore could provide for the safety and security of any of his students. And so, yeah, I think he was justified trying to impose some sort of order on a school that was extremely unsafe and had no government oversight. Then there was the mass breakout at Azkaban, which he didn't believe was caused by Voldemort, suggesting that Sirius Black had done it, because once again, he knows all about Sirius Black, or what he thought he knew about him. Plus, there's no really reason that Voldemort has to be part of it. The other Death Eaters could have just planned it, who escaped justice. I mean, prison breaks happen, especially in a world where everyone has access to powerful magic. It could have literally been like 3 guys who had everything planned out and had a bunch of spells cast ahead of time. There was no reason to believe that. Eventually what happened was he witnessed Voldemort's return firsthand, and he accepted it and stepped down, within a fortnight of the incident, and that led to the end of his career and basically his disgrace and removal from office. So as I was saying about Fudge, I think most of his actions were justifiable. I think most of his actions were attempting to prevent an increasingly inevitable civil war, and I think most of them were of a responsible government official who didn't want to believe a 14-year-old boy suffering from severe PTSD who had no idea of the context and stuff of which he was talking about, and who was known to have visions, hear voices, etc. So you have that aspect of it. He was also kind of weary about taking advice or kind of listening to a known left-wing radical in the form of Dumbledore and giving him too much power or too much favor. So while we can criticize Fudge for not being decisive and for seeking peace at all costs, he knew better than anyone the absolute horrors of the Wizzarding War and wanted to do everything possible to prevent it, probably because he correctly believed that another Wizzarding civil war would more or less destroy their society and kill off most of their rapidly diminishing population, to which I think he was largely right. The Second Wizzarding Civil War killed off a large number of people and did immense damage to their society. I also think he was simply used as a scapegoat for people who didn't understand the immense divisions and problems that he had to deal with. And because the Wizarding world was completely unable or unwilling to take a long, hard look at themselves and look at their responsibility in the crisis. And so much like Neville Chamberlain, they foisted all the blame for a crisis onto a person who really was in no way responsible for it, and realistically probably couldn't do anything about it. We have Cornelius Fudge to thank for 6 years of relative peace that probably would have continued for another decade or so, had not someone returned from the dead in an act that was pretty much almost impossible even in a world where magic exists. So I think Fudge should be remembered as a moderately conservative politician who did his best to deal with an impossible situation, and for a large part made relatively wise decisions based on the information he had and his past experience, who was ultimately scapegoated both by the author and by the Wizarding world.